Yeah, we're now live on YouTube, Chair.
Perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, welcome to the 14th of March meeting of the Northamptonshire Schools Forum. We'll start with item 1, which is about apologies. So we have received apologies from Lisa Bowyer, Victoria Bull, Rob Hardcastle, Annabelle Moore, Angela Prodger, and Robert Tite. And I think there's one you had this morning from Sandra Appleby.
Yeah, that's correct.
Great. And in terms of forum membership changes, Lynn Bolland has resigned from the forum as their PVI representative. So presumably then that leaves a vacancy, does there, for that position?
Yeah.
And how have we historically recruited to those vacancies? Is that just about an email to the sector and let them know?
Yeah, we would generally put out a bulletin to the sector and ask for representatives to apply to join the forum. So we'll be doing that again now.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, that would be great. Thank you. And in terms of declarations of interest, there's no declarations of interest in respect to the agenda have been declared in advance, but if anyone has any would like to declare them, now is the time to do so. So we'll call that as none. And just moving on to item 2, so this is minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of January and any points arising or officer feedback. That was the meeting where I think both myself and Paul were unable to attend. Obviously, I've received the minutes of those, but I just want to check for those that were there, is any comments on accuracy about any of those minutes from that meeting? So if we're happy to approve those as an accurate record. And then also, I can't see on there any particular actions for this meeting other than those which are obviously on the current agenda. And I don't think there is any kind of further officer feedback requested. Is there anything, Raj, that we're expecting on that, or any matters arising that forum members would like to raise?
No, there are no matters arising from those minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, everybody, for those. So if we move on to item 3, which is the DSG update into period 10, and Soraya, if you could introduce the report, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm bringing this report to School Forum to update them on the current position of the DSG grant. This is an updated position following January School Forum. Section 2 of the report gives a background of the DSG grant and its 4 blocks to School Forum members. Coming down to Section 3, the DSG original budget for 23-24 was set at 354.9 million. This allocation was revised in July, leading to a reduction of 308k. The reduction mainly comes from a decrease of 382k in the early years block due to a lower participation numbers, and a slight increase of 74k in the high needs block. This was further adjusted in November by the November allocation by 6k, and after recoupment, the net budget with NNC stands at 120.587 million. Table 3, the table in section 3 breaks this down for you. Moving on to section 4 of the report, the overall outturn forecast at period 10 is an overspend of 9.115 million against the approved budget of 120.587 million after recoupment. This is broken down in the table under section 4.2 of the report. The report lists the reasons relating to the overspend, which is mainly in the high needs block. This was discussed at the last School Forum meeting, and we have had a couple of discussions on this previously, and it will be discussed further in the high needs block paper. But as outlined in the report, the main reasons are an increase in the number of EHCPs that are with NNC, the use of independent placements due to a lack of sufficiency in NNC schools, and mainstream top-ups. Also, not having an AP school also adds pressure to this. We have some overspends as well in the central schools block, but these are mainly due to staffing. Section 4.4 details the work that is taking place within the service to help mitigate these pressures over the next year. And as discussed at the previous school forum meetings, the DSG conditions of the grant set out that any local authority with an overall deficit on its DSG account at the end of the financial year will be required to present a DSG management plan to the DfE. We are making progress on this after meeting with the ESFA and will present it to school forum members soon. Appendix A attached to the report breaks down the spend to cost centre level. So school forum are asked to note this report. And I'll open the floor up to any questions if anyone's got any.
Thanks, Soraya. I'm just trying to think about what's probably the most useful way of taking questions about the high needs block, because obviously Charlotte has a report slightly later on in the agenda. And obviously most of the pressures that you've outlined are in the high needs block. So what I would suggest probably for members, if we've got questions about the high needs block specifically, perhaps we wait until after Charlotte's item and then compile all of those together. Does that sound reasonable to everybody? So are there any questions for Soraya outside of that? Yes, Paul.
Lovely, thanks, James. Soraya, I see the central schools block, looking at the overspend on there, they're down into two areas, the school admissions and the school standards and effectiveness. And we've got down the reasons being due to increased salaries, but that is some increase. And I don't understand why we are so, I don't think just that wording describes why these are so much out of whack. I think the school admissions is a 20% overspend and it's 60% on the school effectiveness. So it can't be anything to do around pay rise. It has to be something more. So I guess my question is a bit more detail into exactly what is sat behind it, and also what we're doing to make sure that this overspend doesn't continue into the next financial year.
So we've had obviously the pay increment this year, and also there's been pay and grading that's gone through. So we've had salaries that have we hadn't really forecasted for pay and grading to go through this year. So on the DSG, it's going forward for 24-25. We are picking it up as part of the budget process to make sure that any sort of increments and stuff are being picked up and budgeted for. But I take your point on board in that sense. But we hadn't budgeted for pay and graded.
And is that all of it? Because I mean, it's a 60% increase. So some people's pay must have shot up, but I mean, way beyond an increment or two. This looks like a wholesale. Lets everyone have a big increase.
It's the increment as well as pay and grading. It's not just pay and grading.
Right. And I understand. I think from the centrals block, usually the funding is relatively stable, isn't it? It doesn't increase dramatically, and I think around some of those historical commitments it drops. So is there a plan in place to bring this back in line with the relevant funding? Are we looking at staffing levels? Perhaps it's one for Neil. I don't know.
Yeah, Chair, if that's okay, I'm happy to respond.
Yeah, please.
Absolutely. I mean, there are significant changes in this bit of the budget. So you might be aware that the land grant got taken away with very little notice, which is part of the issue around school effectiveness, and we need to reshape that. And you'll remember we had the conversation at a previous forum, might have been the one before last, about de-delegations, and there was the normal, if you like, the de-delegation for school effectiveness we have every year, and then but we could delegate more to make up for grant loss and those sort of things that we didn't proceed with. But that's what's linked to that going forward. And so, as you say, we now need to reshape what it is we're able to offer within the scope of. So we certainly won't be looking to overspend again going forward. But as I say, there has been significant shifts in this bit of the world. Admissions is slightly more complicated. I think, as a matter of transparency, I think the budget over this year hasn't developed how it should have done. So we'll just reset it next year to where it needs to be, because the pressure on in-year admissions, every month and every year we say in-year admissions have got to reduce now, haven't they? We can't carry on, and they increase and they increase. And so the admissions team are under huge pressure. So we need to find resource to support them. So exactly as you say, Paul, we need to reshape the budget next year to reflect the available resources. This year was a bit of an oddity because lots of things were moving at once, and we've ended up in this position. And then, as Soraya says, there were some budgeting issues as well. So it is, as you say, a whole mix of things. But yeah, we can assure you that the intention next year is to sit within the budget that we've got available, because there's no capacity.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, everyone. And that is just a report for us to note as forum. So if we move on to item 4, which is the schools monitoring, and I think it's Catherine Walker who's going to discuss this report.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, I'm here this afternoon to update the forum on the schools monitoring at the end of January, that being period 10. So the figures are shown in the report, and they are the latest estimates we have received from said schools. Simply, at the start of the financial year, there was 4 schools with a starting deficit. By the end of the year, we believe that will definitely increase to 6, possibly even 8, based on the latest information known. And the other thing just to highlight as well, it was a question raised at, I believe, the January forum meeting about what support is available to schools who are facing financial difficulty. I'd just like to highlight that schools can request a visit from a traded team, and the search them, we can go out and obviously verify the figures, challenge them, and also provide some advice and guidance on how they can manage that potential deficit. I just wanted to answer that question because, like I said, it wasn't sort of clarified at the previous meeting. But other than that, I obviously asked Schools Forum to note the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Catherine, could I just ask something about a specific school, actually? Just about Great Doddington Primary, that I want to just check I'm reading this correctly, that they began the year with reserves of 148,000 and are going to finish with a 38,000 deficit, which seems a fairly extraordinary change.
It is. However, they have changed their leadership and management in the last financial year as a result of not being able to appoint a substantive head teacher previously, and they are now in a federation with another maintained school, a primary school.
Yeah. So does that in the long term relieve those pressures or exacerbate them?
It potentially exacerbates them. We are actually working proactively with the 2 schools involved as well, to try and sort of mitigate that deficit down.
Okay. Thank you. And the other thing, one of the things that was, I think, raised at an earlier meeting is just for the schools with deficits, that what has their level of engagement been with the local authority? Because there had been a historic concern that some of those schools, despite contact from yourselves, had actually failed to get back to you and engage with you in a meaningful process. And I think we kind of suggested ensuring that we're copying in the chairs of governors and making sure that we raise that as a significant issue.
Yes, well, we still, out of the 4 schools that started the financial year with a deficit, only one submitted a deficit or licence deficit request. The other 3 has still not submitted that information. So there's not really any engagement with those 3 at the moment.
And have we gone there to chairs of governors already to try and ensure that engagement?
I do, Neil, if I ask Neil, I do believe Neil did email those respective schools requesting that information.
Yeah, just to confirm that, Chair, we wrote to schools setting out the process, including the Chair of Governors, as was suggested. We've also established an internal panel that will look at schools that are causing financial concern going forward, where we'll take more formalised action going forward. So yeah, we are picking this up and trying to engage with the schools as effectively as possible. I must apologise, my system is really playing up, so sometimes the camera's working and sometimes it's not, so apologies for that. I'm not turning it on and off. So yeah, that is going on, and like I said, there'll be a more formalised system going forward with an expectation that the head of finance and the DCS sign off and approve deficits as is required.
Okay, and just just final bit for me is what powers do you have if you know, for example, you issue an invitation to a meeting and they don't reply and don't attend, or you write to them and they don't respond? What actually happens next, and what can you do in those circumstances?
So the position is that those schools that don't engage with us are acting outside of the scheme for financing schools, because it has requirements in it. Schools Forum have agreed and signed, seen and signed off this scheme for financing schools. If schools continue to not meet the scheme for financing schools, ultimately we would withdraw delegation from a maintained school anyway, and which would mean to take financial responsibility away from the governors and hold it ourselves. Now, clearly that's absolutely not a route we want to go down. Doesn't help the school or us in particular, given the amount of work that's involved. So we would be engaging with them a lot before we got to that stage. But that is the end point. There is if your question is there any consequence to this? Yes, there can be a consequence to this.
Yeah.
Really prefer to avoid that if at all possible.
Yeah. No, I completely understood. It's just to make sure that there's not. The risk is that some of those schools are effectively just putting their head in the sand and hoping it's not going to happen or kind of be realised, and then carrying on regardless. Which is, you know, where you see about some of those schools that they've been in deficit and the following year looks worse, not better. Great, Peter.
Yeah, so thank you. Just a couple of questions from me on that. Firstly, of the 4 or 8 schools that are in deficit, is it a long-standing deficit or is it an in-year deficit?
The 4 that started the financial year, yes, they're long-term deficits. They have been in deficit position at least 1 full financial year prior to this year.
And are they getting worse or better?
One of them is getting worse, and one's getting better. I think the others are sort of remaining pretty static.
Okay, thank you. I mean, some of the questions I was going to ask have been asked, but I guess my other question, which perhaps is a little bit challenging and you might not want to answer, but if a school was failing in terms of its standards, in terms of Ofsted, then it will be forced to move into a multi-academy trust. Certainly the schools that are been consistently in-year deficit are failing their financial standards, it seems to me. So is there any move through the ESFA to push them into an academy trust, as would happen if their standards were failing?
Okay, I think it's probably for me to pick up again, Chair, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So now, academisation is would not be a direct result of financial failings, because we would obviously withdraw delegation, as I spoke about previously, and take responsibility for that. And I have to say, you know, there are plenty of academies that are struggling financially as well. So this is not just a maintained schools issue. There are plenty of academies with deficits and other issues going on as well. But no, there are many things. What you might take a view of is it might be indicative of a failure of governance. Now that might lead to academisation, but that's why we need to understand the reasons behind it. And as Catherine said, things like failure to recruit head teachers and other things can lead to pressures. And we understand, you know, there are other things around transformation and reshaping of schools that require an overdraft that you then come out of. But it's that plan. And as Catherine said, if we don't have the 3-year budget plan, 5-year budget plan that demonstrates the return to a balanced position, then that's a concern. And that's when we'd be taking further action as we've described. But like I say, the direct result wouldn't be academisation. It might be a contributing factor if there's a broader concern about this.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Can I just
Thanks,
sort of
Paul.
reiterate?
Sorry, Catherine.
There is some element of governors not taking ownership of the problem and taking necessary steps to redress the deficit. There is some element of that, I will say, from my previous experience. So,
sorry, me again. I do apologise, Paul. So yes, if there is a problem with governance, are we then looking at IEBs?
Okay, so I was going to come in, but I'll lower my hand again. So that is the next step on from withdrawal of delegation. You know, so we have a range of measures that we can take in any school where we have financial concerns. So obviously we're going to work collaboratively, and there's lots of work that can go around that. But if we want to take, you know, proactive action, we can appoint additional governors to that school to strengthen the governing body. That's one thing we can do. We can withdraw delegation to say we don't think the governors are managing the budget properly and we need to manage it. We can dismiss the governors and have an interim executive body, as you suggest. So yeah, that is another suggestion. So there is a whole range of things that can happen, and an IEB again would be a very extreme example of that, but one that we would use if we needed to and has been used. Certainly I've been involved with IEBs before, but that's appropriate. I think the problem we have, and I'll take Catherine's point about governors taking ownership of these things, is, as ever with schools, you know, governors see their responsibility as providing the best education possible for the children within the school. But the full version of that statement is providing the best education for all the children in the school within the resources available. You know, and it's that last bit which is the difficult bit. And you know, we really appreciate what governors do, because they're volunteers, and in the current finance climate, they're having to make really difficult decisions to balance budgets, as you all are around schools and those sorts of things. But that is the responsibility of governors, and if they're not fulfilling that responsibility, then they're not acting appropriately as a governor, and that's when we have to take action. But I understand how difficult that is, and I also understand, as I said previously, that, you know, we would support, or I would certainly support, a controlled step-by-step approach to that. So we're not going to go into a school and say you've got, you know, a deficit, cut everything and make it balance. Let's turn the ship and move that around. And that's why the 3- and 5-year budget plans are so important, that they say these are the actions we're taking, and over time, you know, it might not be until year 2 or somewhere that actually we start eating into the deficit, but that's done in a controlled way. So we support services as best we can, and do support children as best we can. But like I say, I don't no, I mean, having been a governor for a very long time, I understand very well the difficult decisions that governors have to make, particularly in the current climate, and we would want to support them to do that before we moved on to the more direct action that we can do if it's required. And a final thing I'd say is, you know, there are moments, you know, where, you know, a governing body might well say, we don't know how to do this, you do it, you know, and actually hand the budget back. And now we'd hope we never got to that stage, but again, you know, you'd understand that decision making is really difficult. So yeah, the key thing is about support. The key thing is the work that Catherine and the team do with supporting governors to manage the budget. and then we hold them to account and take the action only as and when it's necessary.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And I think probably one of the other things to add, it might have been a conversation that I think Paul and I had with Salik. I think the in section 3 of the report, the panel to assist schools facing financial challenge, it was proposed that actually there could be members of schools forum on that panel and practitioners to support with that. Is that right, that that's part of the vision as well, so that you've got perhaps schools that have taken action that can there be part of the support for those schools and governors who are struggling to know quite how to live within their means?
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. And, that fits in really well with, the role we see of the local authority. I mean, a lot of what we do now is about facilitating school to school support, sharing best practice and those sorts of things. We don't have all the answers here. We know that. And as you say, however we do that, we would want to bring together, certainly from a governance perspective, governors to learn from let's say, best practice and those sorts of things. In terms of the panel, yeah, it's really embryonic. We're just getting up and running. But yeah, we'll look at the membership and make sure that there is transparency, because the whole point of this is to greater transparency and greater understanding across the piece. So absolutely, we'll have a conversation at probably the next forum about how we can make that happen and what that might look like and how they might report back here.
Right. Thanks, Neil. Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. The question I got really was, outside of the number of schools increasing that's going into deficit, across the whole piece, there's a substantial forecast drop in reserves, about a 43% drop in reserves from the opening position. Now, I think there'll be people who are faring better than others, which is quite clearly laid out in the report. But Catherine, what reporting do you have to do to the SFA where they maintain schools' reserves, not just where they go into deficits and there has to be recovery plans, but when effectively across the whole thing there's such a substantial drop in reserves? It looks to me like the level that's forecast to be held is still, as a whole, is still not completely a worry, but it looks like it's heading that way.
The only reporting I'm aware of is at the end of the financial year with regards to consistent financial reporting, that then determines what the school's carry forward is and how that is split between revenue and capital. And I think that's come up in the past, how much they commit and uncommitted. And I know Schools Forum have looked at that sort of over the past years, but that I'm assuming the ESFA will look at that information as a block for the whole of those maintained schools in Northamptonshire, well, North Northamptonshire. I've not had any, other than that, I've not had any direct reporting of reserves.
Right.
But I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that I think part of the reason the reserves are declining is the actual pay award. Certainly for support staff pay award, because that was really not funded. So that obviously we're aware the teachers has been assisted by extra grants, but the support staff one, and that was quite a high percentage, depending on how many support staff the actual school has, and that's where the higher percentages was. So overall, I think that's why schools have had to call on reserves far greater in this last financial year.
And so you'd expect then to see that trend continue, because the funding for the schools has been agreed, and at the last round of pay negotiations with the support staff, the employers recognised that they had to keep the most of those grades above minimum wage, and so were likely to end up with an increasing pay burden.
Absolutely. In the latest 3-year plan, I have made the assumption that the 1925 will continue, although I do know that there are other unions are possibly suggesting different figures. But so, and with my experience when I've been visiting schools very, very recently, a lot of them are finding it challenging in setting balanced budgets for the upcoming year.
Right, we'll see that.
I just think that's the situation we currently find ourselves. from my experience so far, is only going to actually possibly get worse.
And will hence need more support and advice in how to balance their budgets, I would suggest.
Yes, and some schools are already, have called upon myself to go in and have a look, and they are taking necessary steps to try and mitigate that down longer term. Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, muted myself. Thanks, Catherine. And Catherine Murphy.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Catherine was saying, really, and I know she's been in and spoken to my business manager, and obviously we've factored in what we think might be rises, and there's a contribution from the government for teachers, but it doesn't cover, we've got a lot of long-standing staff who are all at the, very expensive, and then an increase of any percent, it has a huge impact. So I understand the pressures that everybody's feeling, and don't know what the answer is, but it certainly is an issue with both teaching and non-teaching staff increases. And thank you for your help, Catherine.
Yeah, I think that probably illustrates the real importance of engagement with Catherine, the local authority. I think you're right. There's one thing about the financial pressures there in the schools. I think it's a quite different thing if you're seeing schools with rampantly accelerating deficits and actually no engagement with the local authority about how to reduce those. That's where you've got a kind of even more significant risk against that national backdrop of funding. But hopefully the sort of measures Neil and Catherine have outlined and the establishment of that panel will go some way to resolve that. Any other questions or comments on item 4? Okay, great. I'll hand over to Charlotte for item 5, which is our eagerly anticipated high needs updates.
Chair, I think that might be me again. I don't know. I've got Charlotte's name against it.
Oh, apologies. I had Charlotte's name. Sorry, Charlotte.
Raj,
right, okay. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you. Raj, do you have the presentation to share?
Yeah, I do. Sorry, one second. I'll just share the screen.
My system's just really not going to do that today. I'm having all sorts of issues, I think. So this is very much an update. This is very much an update on the previous conversation that we had, the presentation, which I think members found useful around the position of the high needs block. Oh, that's it. Turned up. Thank you, Raj. So this is an update on that with some additional information put in it that wasn't there previously for information, and we'll go through that. And then, as the chair mentioned, we'll have questions at the end. So this is an update of the current budget position for the high needs block and the projection for next year. This is a moving feast at the moment, as we're still finding new estimates moving things along. But you'll see the variance for this year about 9.9 million, a bit more than it was previously, and the deficit for next year's currently about 8.5 million. I think this year's is about set now. I don't think that'll move again, but next year's I think will increase further. We went through this in some detail last time, but again, you can see the key issues here. Well, there are lots of key issues, aren't there? But the things that are around AP, independent provision, extra places at special schools, and mainstream top up. So you can see that variance column where we're overspending the initial budget, and that's concern, and that links to many of the issues that Sarai mentioned earlier in her presentation. What I do have to inform Forum is that we were unsuccessful in our bid for a new AP school. That information which we were promised in the autumn came out this week. It's not entirely clear why that was the case as yet. Again, a bit like our special free schools bid, it was well oversubscribed, and others may have had a stronger case, but we are in a position where we have no AP. It's causing significant budget pressures, so I would have anticipated that would have lent weight to our bid, but unfortunately, like I have to say, that's not been successful. We'll be engaging with DFE about why that's the case, what we can do, and what alternative action we can take. But in relation to this paper, you can see that the overspending alternative provision is significant, and a lot of that is around home tuition because we don't have AP, and we're putting in 10 hours or whatever it might be of tuition for children who are not in school. And that is, as you can imagine, a really expensive way to deliver that education. So something we need to do about. And you'll be aware MTAS is working with some of the maths to look at how we can do internal work around different routes to AP and those sorts of things, but that's a concern. The rest of that, the half percent that we agreed is on here. I left the other element on there. I think, or did I take it? I took it off. So yeah, to the 0.5% transfers on there, that happens. But you'll see the cumulative deficit for next year is climbing again, and it wouldn't surprise me if that was higher than that as we go into next year and have, you know, some of those children who remain unplaced get placed and have to be through independent at significant cost. You'll see our independent spend for next year is budgeted at about 13.7 million. We have 195 children, I think, in independent provision at the moment. So an average cost of about £68,000 per place per year. You'll be aware some are very much higher than that and some less than that, but that's a significant pressure as well. Mainstream top-ups we're going to talk about later because that comes under the RAS reports, and we'll come back to that about what we're going to do about that. And special schools, obviously, we're looking to expand capacity in our special schools, and that's why there's no overspend there. So that's what that looks like. This week we met with the ESFA again to have a conversation. This week, I mean last week, we met with a conversation about our management plan. We've committed to get the management plan to them by the end of May. We work with Forum with that as and when it's developed. So they're aware of this, and they're going to put some challenge into the system on how we're spending our money, and we'll pick that up as we go forward. If we go on to the next slide, please, Raj. So these are just some slides from the SEND needs assessment that Public Health have done, just to give you some idea. So this is the growth in SEND levels over the past 5 years. So the darker coloured purple ones, I guess, are children with SEND support, and the blue ones are EHCPs. And you can see both have gone up, but EHCPs have gone up more rapidly, and the number today is more than that, so more like 3,800, and that continues to rise, and that obviously leads to pressure. If we go on to the next slide, please, Raj. So this is a forecast. So Public Health have done a forecast of future need with a confidence level. So orange is the lower limit confidence level, green is the top level confidence level, and blue is the most likely outcome as they would see it. And you can see SEND support levels continue to increase rapidly, and we go from our current 6,500 to almost 9,500 in the 10-year period that this covers. The next one, Raj. Thank you. This is EHCPs. This is slightly more worrying, or even more worrying. The confidence levels you see is wider because there are more factors involved in EHCPs, and the impact of COVID is not fully understood, and all those sorts of things. But still, if you look, if we're at 3,500 now, in 5 years' time we're at 5,500, and at an average cost, that's an extra £13.8 million worth of EHCP top-ups that we'll be looking for in the next 5 years. And I think we can confidently say funding won't increase at that rate. So that is a real concern. And then obviously that carries on out to 2033, and we end up with over 7,000 children with an EHCP, which is a really, really big number, but not unusual when we talk to our colleagues in other local authorities. So I think it's a useful graph showing the direction of travel and where we are at the moment. Next one, please. So what I've done is just pulled out some of the pressure. So as the 13.8 million in the top point, that's what I was just talking about. If things continued as per that EHCP graph, we would be spending 13.8 million more a year just for EHCPs in mainstream. That's without anything else. I think this does reflect that the funding increase does not reflect the increase in need. So if we did a similar graph with the rate of increase in funding, it would not rise at the same rate, and something we just need to be aware of, that we're trying to be more and more efficient and effective with overall less money. We do need to invest to support the outcomes of the SEND inspection. That's not public yet, and as you'll be aware with Ofsted, we have to be very careful about what we say. But you'll know our self-assessment was that there are many challenges, and we need to do a great deal to move forward. In order to do that and to be prepared for 18 months when we get a monitoring visit, there's a lot of investment to be required to make that happen across the partnership, and that's what the next point's about. SEND as a partnership, the SEND Accountability Board is really key in this, and we need to work with our colleagues in health and the trust to make sure that's recognised and delivers efficiencies. There is lack of capacity. I've talked about this. Overall, the system is bunged up, in a technical term, but bunged up. We just don't have the release valve of allowing children to flow out into special provision that would give more support for mainstream schools to, work on a broader level in the way that they would like to. And I think that's a real concern for us. And we really need to do something fairly drastic about that going forward. Ongoing AP, I've just talked about that in the bid, which is unfortunate. We do continue to invest in early help as much as we can. So the early help in around outreach and those sort of things is still there. To take that away would be to store up problems in the future, but equally it costs money now. And there is pressure on mainstream and secondary particular spaces, and that does have an impact on inclusion because schools are being asked to take more and more children. And if they've got children with higher needs, the pressure, you don't need me to tell you, the pressure that is on the staff and the resources of the school. We can move on, Raj, please. Okay, so these are repeat slides from last time, but I thought I'd just leave them in. These are what we presented to the DFE of what we need. So, some of them are pretty wishful thinking, so the first one, the funding doesn't reflect the need. So we'd want them to recognise that. We'd want them to consider a greater than 0.5% transfer, but that would be subject to schools forum, of course, but that would give us some room. Additional access to additional resources, whether that's one-off or project-based to help us support developments. Capital, we needed the AP bid, we didn't get it. We need new special schools, so we need access to capital for that. Access to capital to improve facilities in the schools that we've got. We need them to help us in the messages they're giving schools around the support for inclusion and the focus on inclusion, and that schools funding needs to be reviewed to reflect the needs that you're all managing. Next one, please, Raj. From our perspective, we want to be sharing best practice. I talked about that, facilitated school-to-school support and all those other things, and we're working at a regional level with colleagues around that as well. We need effective support from the DFE for us. If they're going to say there are improvements that are required, then they need support in doing that. And I have to say they are giving us more time from the DFE improvement advisor, so that's helping. We wanted clarity around what's expected around the budget position. I think we've got some of that from the recent meeting about the management plan and the things that go along with that. So that's helpful, but clearly we need to follow that through and make sure that we do deliver on that. What's called the statutory override, which is what allows the councils to hold a deficit in the DSG in their accounts, is basically coming to an end at March 2026. But if that were to go, the number of councils going bust would increase very significantly. So I think it's safe to say that will carry on, but we need that assured and in legislation. And we need the medium-term funding to look at those sort of things. And obviously we need Ofsted to support us in terms of supporting inclusion and the SEND inspection and those sort of things. I think that's it, Raj. So hopefully that's a helpful update on what we had last time. If you're happy with this as the forum, we'll continue to do something in a fairly similar format going forward and just add things and take them away as we go forward, so you can see the changes that are going on. As I say, we've used this presentation in lots of fora now, and it is generally well received, and people found it useful. It's certainly been presented to members at the EAP panel, and to the DFE and the SFA and those sorts of things. So you're seeing exactly what we're saying to everybody else, and because we want to be as transparent as we can in addressing the budget pressures. So I'll stop and take any questions, Chair, if there are any, on what I've said.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I mean, just to say, I think the forum is the format of it is really helpful. That I know historically when we'd had information, the questions have been about specifically where the pressures are, and it's really useful to have it laid out in that way, and also to see the increase in demand and where that's occurring. Yeah, not that it gives us any solutions, but it is useful to see where the pressures are. Catherine.
Hi, I just wondered, Neil, if there was anything we can do to support, if you're going back to ask why the bid wasn't successful, either as head teachers or, other members of the community. Is there anything we can do in terms of pointing out the obvious of how needed it is, and whether there's another round of bidding coming up?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think in terms of this bid, we're just in feedback mode, so awaiting feedback to understand what that is. I do think over the coming months and maybe into the next meeting of the forum and beyond, those slides at the end where we are making requests of the DFE and ESFA, together we can update those so that we are making a shared, request to the DFE about those sort of things. I think that would be really helpful. So what is it that would help? I think we need to think about the problems, somewhat differently and more widely than we do. So absolutely, we want to go as a system, and that includes our partners through the Send Accountability Board to DFE to get their feedback. But like I say, in terms of the AP bid itself, I think we're just going to get feedback because that's all we're going to get. I am told there's going to be another round of special school free school bids shortly, and of course we'll be throwing our hat into the ring again for that and being hopeful of getting a more positive outcome. And colleagues are very welcome to support us in that process.
And are there ways of reducing the cost of tutoring? I mean, is there a way of employing a tutor rather than because the cost, as we know, the costs of individually booking tutors are extortionate? Is there some way to reduce that cost, because that's the situation we're still in?
Yeah, well, from our perspective, our commissioning function is only just really taking off, and I think we've been in a position where we've been procuring those almost on an individual basis, and we should be purchasing a framework and blocks of time and those sorts of things. And so Laura Priestnall and the commissioning team are absolutely on that case. So yes, we can do that much better than we currently do. I think the rate of escalation of that's really caught us by surprise. We didn't expect to be this, and actually, our main provider is unable to meet demand, and we've had to go out and seek other providers as well. So yeah, absolutely, that we can be better at procuring, but that's true of independent schools and other things as well. Commissioning is one of those areas, and you'll see it in the SEND report when it comes out. Commissioning is a really key area for us to increase, because historically there just hasn't been any. And like I say, whilst Susan and Laura and colleagues have set it up and we're getting going, it takes a while. It's not something that instantly impacts, but yeah, there is stuff we can do.
Right, thank you.
Thanks. Marie.
Thank you, Chair. First thing I just wanted to point out really to Neil and Charlotte is how effective the outreach teams have been. Working with Maplefield and Rowan Gate has really, really made a big difference to the SEND support that we can provide in schools. So I'm really grateful to the teams for that, and I do think that's making a difference. But my second question is, looking at all of those graphs and the direction of travel, which is clearly only in one direction, what are we doing around integrating more units within mainstream primary schools? I'm speaking on behalf of primary schools, to make that more successful, because there are children in mainstream primary schools who are really, really struggling, who are certainly not going to get a special school place anytime soon, who are probably not going to get a secondary school special place, and then exclusion becomes an option, and then tuition becomes really expensive. So how can we be a bit more on the front foot and allow primary schools the opportunity to bid to run a special in-house unit provision?
Okay, so firstly, thank you. I agree. I think the outreach, and I think you'll see when the inspection report comes out, the SEND inspectors recognise that the outreach services were making a difference. So absolutely agree with that, and we'll have more of that coming online next year. So absolutely important. In terms of units, I think it's important to understand, well, put it a different way. Overall, we have a sufficiency problem. What we don't want to do, clearly, is create too much capacity in any one particular area. So we need to make it balanced. We are still at a point where we are pursuing most options where a school comes forward and says we'd like a unit. We'd be really happy to send out a feasibility team, understand what that's going to look like, and go forward with that. So absolutely, that is an opportunity, and we want schools to have that opportunity going forward. It has to be clear that that would then be a fully formed unit, where admissions are managed through the local authority and those sorts of things. And our experience has been, whilst some of those have been really successful, in other examples, for many very valid reasons, they haven't progressed as we would have hoped, and for very, like I say, in no way criticising the school or the local authority. I think we together come to the decision it's not the right thing to do. So I guess what I'm saying is that opportunity is absolutely there. I'm really happy, and if you think it'd be helpful to go back out to schools and make that clear again, we'd be happy to do so. But the path between wanting to do something and actually delivering it is is not always as straightforward as we'd hope. We do have, though, capital to support those things. You know, it's one of those areas where we do have capital to create capacity, and we're absolutely keen to do that as much as we can. So yeah, absolutely agree. Happy to contact schools again and say, let's have another think about this, because we've kind of been through a tranche of these, and then take those forward where it's possible to do so.
Thanks, Neil. In my time as head here, I've not seen anything come out from the local authority as to a formal mechanism to make that request. So maybe I've missed it, in which case, apologies. But I genuinely haven't seen anything. I know at the beginning, when high needs funding was pulled, one of the rationale was there were lots of ad hoc arrangements. It was unfair. It wasn't a level playing field, and you wanted to unpick all that. And I understand that fully. But if we're now in a position where everything is fair and transparent and systems are in place, I think schools do need to know that there's some capital funding and the opportunity to have units, because I visited lots of schools over the past few weeks, and so many schools, MAPs and local authority schools, are running their own unofficial units, that there are lots of children, I think, in the system who perhaps aren't known officially as needing that kind of unit provision, and that's going to be a big shock when I get to the end of year 6.
Yeah, I reckon so. I think we did make the request, but it might have been some time ago, or you might be absolutely right. So we can absolutely revisit that, and we'll do happy to do that and make that clear what the opportunity is, because there is opportunity, and this is a good time to do that because our capital allocations for next year will come forward. I think we do have to be careful, as I said, about the difference between an in-house, inward-looking unit and a unit on a school site, which, as I say, admissions are managed through the local authority. So it's not just for that school's pupils; it's for the broader cohort of children, and there is absolute value in both of those models, but one is fundable by us and one is not fundable by us, and we have to be careful about doing that. And there's perhaps more we can do to support schools to do the former. You know, it might be we could use capital resource to help schools create internal units that support their own school, and that's something I'd be really happy to have a conversation about as well going forward. So, like I say, we're really happy to be as creative as we can be. And I agree with you. I think the other issue we have is that we have a number of units at primary, but not as many at secondary. And so we need a progression plan that says when children have moved through the primary, where do we go from here? And it's something else that we want to work on.
Thank you, Neil. I think a progression plan is a really good idea, and I wonder if it's worth doing an exercise much in the same way we do the reduced timetable, and asking primary schools who they are doing some kind of internal nurture or unit for, so that we've got some predictability in the system, rather than this being a shock when children get to the end of year 6 and suddenly can't cope in a mainstream class of 30 because they haven't been in one for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful, Marie, and that transition point is a really key, as you know, really key time for that. So yeah, happy to work with colleagues about how we might do that and have a better view of that going forward, because what we have is too many children coming out of primary, going into secondary, immediately requiring an EHCP, and then moving into some kind of special provision, and actually that could be better planned. So yeah, happy to do that.
Great, thanks, Marie and Neil. I think that's a really productive discussion. I mean, I think, yeah, I'm not sure, Marie, when the timing was, but there was something, I think, historically from the local authority about expressions of interest for those school-based units. I wonder if it would be a useful thing. I think if perhaps you've alluded to, Neil, is that if when that goes out again, it is really clear the different kind of types of unit, which is, or the different types of the kind of school-based alternative provision. One, which is about the school doing something for its existing pupils, and then how can the local authority support that or not? And then 2, the type of provision that's actually adding capacity to the system in general, so that is on top of a school's plan, that admissions would be managed through the local authority and the EHC process, because I suspect you're right that there isn't always clarity about those 2 types, or indeed what the different role of the local authority would be in each of those 2 types. So it would be really useful if there's a kind of an expression of interest form that you have to fill in that kind of makes it clear actually what schools are requesting and what they would like to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be really helpful, Chair. So thanks for that. If I could add a third option to your list, though, which is option 3, is a special school satellite on site, and so the children are on the roll of the special school, but educated on a mainstream school site to take advantage of the inclusive opportunities that provides.
Okay,
now,
yeah.
You'll be aware of, why having the children on the roll of the special school is sometimes a better option for them and for the mainstream school as well, so that can work as well. So I think there are 3 options: the internal one, the outward looking unit, and then the special school satellite. So each of those have got merits in their own way.
Yeah, perfect. Agreed. Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. Anything else on that item?
Can I just ask
Marie,
one?
sorry, is that a follow-up? Yeah, please do.
Well, no, it's a separate question actually, please, Chair, about the EHLF panel and the fact that we were waiting for some confidentiality protocol to be drawn up so that head teachers could sit on that as a lay member and just provide some feedback. Okay, so Charlotte's got her hand up and I'm sure she'll want to respond to this. All I'll just say to begin with, we are committed to making this happen and it will happen, but Charlotte can give an update on the process by which we'll get to that point. Charlotte?
Yeah, we're very, very nearly there. So we've written all the protocol, we've done the terms of reference, we've written the confidentiality agreement. It just now needs to go out along with, I've got about 5 items that need to go out in the head teacher's bulletin that I'm pulling all together. That is one of those 5 items, and it should go out. It will definitely go out before Easter, so the opportunities will be there post Easter, and there's information how you book on, etc. So it will go out, absolutely will go out to heads before Easter.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. And I've probably just got one more question really for Neil about that I'm aware this might be a completely impossible question to answer, but on the slides, with that kind of level of projected increased need that we're seeing both in schools and that we're seeing across the across Northamptonshire and indeed nationally, and the fact that it looks like there is never actually going to be enough money to cover the demands and the needs, is what sense do you get from the DFE that they recognise that it's probably, it's a broken system and that something is actually going to have to fundamentally change if it is ever to be the case that the funding meets the actual need? Do you get any sense of that, or what they're thinking is in the much longer term about actually how do you square this for Northants but also nationally?
So it's interesting you should say that, Chair. I had a conversation with Paul Andrews, the head of the virtual school, this morning. He'd been to the national conference and DFE had been there speaking about this very issue. And he summarised what they said as until there's clarity about the shape of the future government, things won't change. So until there's been a general election and the new government, whichever colour that may be, is in place and starts making some decisions, nothing is going to change before then. But after that, they recognise that things will have to change. But the direction of that change may well be dependent on the outcome of political changes or not. So there is recognition that things need to change, but not encouragement that that's going to happen rapidly, because the political machinations of central government will need to come into play, and some really key funding decisions made, which any new government may find difficult to make in the short term. And so I think the timescale is quite extended. So I think there really is a concern.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Neil. Thank you. Okay, item 6 we shall move on to, which I think is Charlotte, which is about a paper regarding funding bands.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Raj, are you able to bring that up on the screens or for people?
Yeah, I can share that 1 second.
Thank you. So this paper is not yet for decision or or it has no kind of preconceived outcome as such, but it is just about looking at things that we may need to look at, we may wish to look at. So this is around the band funding that is in particular in relation to young people, children who have got an education, health and care plan. So at the moment, we distribute funding in line with a banding system. So statutory guidance advises that we should have a banding system, and we have a banding system in place. And when children have an education, health and care plan, they are allocated to a band of funding that goes out to their school. Now, what we are hearing in particular from mainstream schools that have got children with an education, health and care plan is that the current banding system is not always sufficient enough for that school to be able to provide everything that is in that child's plan that the school have to provide. So we've listened to schools around that, and we understand that is sometimes the case, and that's difficult. So we're constrained with the banding, but they are constrained with the fact that they can't provide everything in the plan within those current levels of banding. So we have to consider that, but we also have to consider that in the sort of overall perspective that we understand that we are in a deficit position this financial year, predicting to be in a deficit position again next financial year, and the reviews of those banding, because people are saying that they're not sufficient enough, is likely to increase the cost instead of lowering the cost. So we have to consider that kind of within the element. So what this paper is looking at and sort of considering should be the options going forward is, should we consider to progress with a subcommittee of Schools Forum to complete some modelling to look at what the implications of this may be should we choose to review the banding. So at the moment, it's not an agreement that we will review banding, but it's an agreement to move forward with a subcommittee to look at the possibilities. Now, the modelling is somewhat complex. It's not as simple as saying there are 10 children that are on the highest band of funding, and what would it mean if those 10 children were to increase their banding, because as you can imagine, children move across the bands of funding at different points through the year. We have new children coming into the band of funding. We have children that change settings within that, so then move on to a different banding. So it's quite a complicated picture to try and do some modelling. I did try to do some, but it is really, really complex in order to do that. We also have to bear in mind that any looking at the modelling for this level of banding will mean that we need to consider banding overall. So we need to consider our RAS band for special schools and our early help locality funding bands as well. So it's not just located to mainstream education, health and care plan top-up funding. And so the recommendation really is for Schools Forum to decide on whether or not now is an appropriate time to review the EHC funding bands. By sort of saying that we don't review them is a challenge, because the local authority are legally bound to provide the support that is coming from a child's education, health and care plan. So there is a potential another financial impact on the local authority by not considering these banding. And we also have to consider that if we are not able to provide schools with appropriate levels of funding, that may then mean that they are unable to meet the child's needs, and therefore the child needs a different type of provision, which may be more costly inevitably anyway. So this is about making sure that we have got appropriate levels of funding going into what is usually the child's local community school in order to support their needs best, but in the picture of that we are overall facing a deficit. So it's a consideration as to now the time that we should set up a subcommittee to look at this. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Sorry, I lost all my controls there for a second. Thanks ever so much. Questions or comments for Charlotte there? Yeah, Marie.
Hi, thanks, Charlotte, for explaining that. In answer to the question, in its simplest terms, yes, I think there does need to be a subcommittee and a group of people looking at this. But a separate question I've got is just looking on the appendix there to the report. Those figures seem quite out of date, that the money quoted would pay for 10 hours of a TA. I wonder if they've been updated recently in line with support staff pay rise, because where you've got that 6K would cover 10 hours of a TA, it wouldn't. The lowest paid TA on level 2 would cost £7,000 to the school for 10 hours of support. So perhaps that's something that the subcommittee needs to look at as well.
Yeah, Charlotte, do you want to come back on that?
Apologies, I didn't mean to clap there. I meant to put my...
You can give applause to forum members. That's perfectly fine.
Apologies. And it's exactly that, Marie. We haven't reviewed them. They have been set, and that's what they are. And that is what schools are telling us in particular is the challenge. So the challenge is for those young people who require a high level of one-to-one support, some of them all of the time, the current highest banding of funding is not sufficient to meet the costs of a teaching assistant plus on cost within school. So that is the main area of challenge that we're getting from schools. There's lots in that as well, but as it stands, the banding is what it is. We don't operate outside of the banding system. We've moved away from special arrangements with schools. We have to operate within the banding system, and is the banding system now sufficient enough for schools?
Thank you. I definitely think a subcommittee is a good idea. I also think if we look back at the first agenda item around the schools that started the year with quite a healthy surplus and are now finishing the year with rapidly depleted funds or even in a deficit, probably staffing and TA support is the #1 reason for that. And we just know that's not going to be sustainable. So there'll be lots of children and young people suffering more in the years to come as budgets are pulled back, because people haven't got those surplus reserves to fall back on to pay staffing costs. So I do think it's something that we should look at urgently.
Yeah, great. And I think I agree. I think the kind of idea of a subcommittee would be a really positive thing. I think what would be crucial, and I don't know what involvement kind of Yoki and the team could have in that, is I think it's the modelling of what that means for the high needs block if the bands are increased, because I mean, you know, hence the question to Neil really about you know the long-term systemic reform, because the issue you've got is you can increase the bands to whatever you like, but every increase will then increase the deficit in the high needs block that then somehow is going to have to be balanced at some point in the future. And obviously that's a really difficult thing for the council, and you know, and how we explain that to schools as well is difficult, because there isn't the money to fund an increase in bands. So what level of increased deficit do we live with? And I realise that's a question without an answer, but I do think it's important to have the modelling information so that is a known, so that committee doesn't sort of decide it, I guess, from a unilaterally schools point of view, where schools, we are always going to say, well, what we need is an increase in banding, but actually does that leave us with a worse problem in terms of a massively overloaded deficit in the high needs block? But yeah, so I think my view would be that would be a great thing to have with the subcommittee, but alongside some of the financial modelling too. Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. We need a subcommittee and all that. This is just a wider point, really, but it's quite clear, isn't it, that there isn't enough money in the system. You know, we want more. We want a bigger banding system because schools are struggling, absolutely. But we're sitting on a cumulative 18 million deficit for high needs. And somebody mentioned earlier that nothing's going to change until we have a general election. So is it incumbent upon the local authority and perhaps us as members of the forum to make sure that we appropriately lobby our MPs and our potential future MPs around this issue? I'm certainly meeting Tom Perslove, not quite sure.
Perslove, yeah.
In tomorrow, which I'm of course really looking forward to. And I'll be certainly mentioning this to him now as part of my discussion with him.
Yeah, agreed. I think that is yeah. I mean, it's difficult to know, isn't it, in terms of an election, who whether it's incumbents or potentials or perhaps both. Maybe that's the answer for bits of lobbying. Yeah, Neil.
Yeah, just to add to that, we are a member as a council of what's called the F40 group, which is the lower funded children's services group of local authorities who are currently doing an awful lot of lobbying, I have to say. And we are kept up to date with that, and I'll be happy to share that information if you'd like to see it at some point to see what they're up to. But you know, they're a very factual based lobbying, so they use data like we've just shared with you, and in a non-political way go and talk to politicians and say this is the pressures that we as councils are facing. So you know, we are part of that, just so you're aware that our issues are escalated nationally through that group and the work that we all do as well, of course.
Yeah, and I think actually that's a really good point, because I think there's an email group that I think forum members can probably sign up to that gives you some details of the lobbying that F40 group are undertaking in Parliament, and it's the Neil will probably have the definition better than I, but it's the idea that group represents the 40 most disadvantaged councils in terms of funding, of which Northamptonshire is one, with a slight anomaly being I think there are now 43 rather than 40. But yeah, have I explained that correctly, Neil, about the nature of that group?
Yeah, historically it was the 40 authorities who are funded least well on a per pupil basis for Harney's Block, but it's sort of moved around a bit since then. But basically it's the same. It's those local authorities who are least well funded due to the nature of the national funding formula, and that's what they lobby about. Really, as I say, it's not a political lobby; it's a very factual, financial base that says, I mean, their bottom line is this is not fair for the children in our areas that we're not getting this. And I remember a few years ago they were giving a demonstration of, and I can't remember which local authority it was, but I think it was one in Berkshire from what I remember. If they were funded at the rate that Middlesbrough were funded at, they got, you know, some huge amount extra money, £100 million more or something. It just showed, which isn't to say Middlesbrough get too much, but just to say that disparity is very difficult to justify sometimes.
Yeah, great, thank you. So in terms of an action and next step, Charlotte and is that how will you request volunteers to be on that subcommittee?
That's a good question. I would say, and is it a volunteers to be part of that subcommittee, and then we sort of set up meetings going?
I think so. Yeah, I think you know, if you want it to be a kind of subcommittee of schools forum, I think it's probably worth obviously sending out to all forum members and saying, you know, I suppose what I propose is make it specific as possible and say, look, you know, I think this is the date we want to have our inaugural meeting, so you make sure that people can make that, and then you set that a venue, and then we go from there. Because I speaking for other forum members, I know it's an issue that we wrestled with and will continue to wrestle with. So I'm sure that you will get people that will be willing to participate. Great.
We'll just add to that, Chair. Sorry, Chair. If I can just add to that to say, yeah, I'm really clear that this should be a subgroup of this forum. So that's how it's constituted. It comes, and so the The reason for that being the output comes back to you for consideration. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Obviously, Councillor Edwards is in the meeting and listens to our conversations, but obviously there's a broader conversation to be had. And as you say, we'd want that group to be informed by Yoki and the finance team, and also Charlotte and the HCP team, and all of that to come together into a position where we've got a shared understanding. But I think it's really important it comes through this group as representative, and then into the broader budgeting process of the council as we move forward. So yeah, that'd be really great. And I think the process that you suggested we can follow.
Perfect. Great. Thanks ever so much. Moving on to item 7, I realise I'm at a slight disadvantage because I can't see the paper for that in my pack. I don't know if that is just something that is not printed for me. Does everybody else have access to that? And the voting for that is just on for maintained members only, which is to agree one of 3 options. Do you have that to hand, Raj, that you could possibly share?
Yeah, I can share that. When the initial dispatch went out, it was a item to follow, so it did follow via email, and it's also available on the website.
Fine. Apologies, that's mine for not grabbing hold of. And is Sarah here to present that? It doesn't look like that. So who is going to present and take any questions?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't see Sarah on the call. She did receive the invitation, so Yoki, I'm not sure if you could present this or.
Chair, I can basically tell you what Sarah said in the emails. So basically, under the scheme that they are proposing, they've gone back, to the group that is actually the Schools and Academies Insurance Framework Group, and we agreed to a delegation for schools insurance service for a year for 24-25. However, what's come back from this collaboration is that this has to be a 2-year contract, and obviously the rates haven't changed, the rates have stayed the same, but obviously schools will need to agree a 2-year contract. It will need to come back to Schools Forum next January for reapproval, obviously, because we can only agree on an annual basis based on our funding. However, the contract will be for 2 years. So what Sarah said in this paper is, do Schools Forum still wish to proceed with the delegation of schools insurance service for 24-25? Because if we do, then it will be for 2 years. Otherwise, it will revert back to the traded service option.
Raj, can you just flip through to the list of the 3 different options that we've got essentially?
Yeah, so those are the 3 options under the recommendation section.
Okay, and this is for just maintained school members only?
Yes. It's just for maintained primary and secondary schools. For the maintained special and nursery schools, it will proceed with the traded service option because they're not part of the delegation.
Yeah. So just for my understanding, so option 1 is you continue with the delegation for 2 years. Option 2 is no delegation and it becomes a traded service. Yeah. And option 3 is that schools join the RPA.
The RPA scheme, which is operated by the ESFA.
Yes. And do they do that as individual schools, or do they do that?
Yes.
So that's not a collective.
But clearly, if Schools Forum have agreed for the delegation, it will apply to all maintained primary and secondary schools. They cannot choose to, opt for RPA because that's the option that we, Schools Forum have decided.
Yeah, understood. Paul.
Thanks, James. I went through this. I did go through this paper in some detail, although it doesn't apply to our vote as an Academy member. But I think the one thing that I'm sure my maintained colleagues would need, I think it's in the paper, but it wasn't 100% clear, the mechanism for it, some assurance around, is the provider only is guaranteed at the present time the pricing for 1 year, although they want a 2-year requirement deal to be done. And I think when I read the paper, it intimated that effectively all bets were off if they increase the pricing in the 2nd year. But at the moment, they're not making any promises on that. And if I was voting on this as a delegation, I'd want to be absolutely 100% certain that if they push the price up, if the price goes up next year once they reprice it, that there was an option, a very firm option to cancel the year 2 of it. At the moment, it's marginally cheaper than the RPA, and there are variances in cover, but it's a reasonable cover. I can't imagine why anyone would not want to have a delegation for it, with the exception of you could find yourself tied in for 2 years and the price goes up in year 2, unless there is a get out clause, a break clause.
There isn't at the moment. Obviously, what she's proposing in this paper is we will be tied in for 2 years, and obviously they haven't said any more about the 2nd year.
So just theoretically, what would happen if they doubled the premiums in year 2? Is that just...
From what I can see from the paper, they'd just be stuck with it. There wouldn't be an option to get out of it. I think there might be something in there in the body of the report that suggests that you'd want basically a break clause of some description in there, because it has gone up a lot from the last year. It was, as the report outlines, about £18, I think, in the current financial year. The numbers are in the report. So it may not go up, but there's no guarantee. That was the question I was going to have for Sarah.
Thanks, Paul. That seems like a question that is with, well, not without an answer, but the answer is that actually that it's at the maintained school's risk if they vote for a delegation. Yeah, Catherine.
Thank you, Paul, for raising that. Yeah, I don't know whether we actually want to vote on that now or whether we want to go back and clarify, because I can't vote yes to something where I don't have any clue, any protection about what next year's finance might, contribution might be. So at the moment, I would not be voting for that. But in principle, it's a good idea and it would make sense. So I don't know whether we want to vote or whether we want to see if we can clarify that.
Yoki, what's the time pressure there?
The difficulty of this at the moment is the fact that obviously the new financial year starts in 2 weeks. So, we need to know whether we will delegate or not delegate. In January, we agreed to delegate, but we only agreed for 1 year term. If they're not going to provide it for 1 year term, then, there's no way we can, proceed with the delegation, and it will then revert back to the traded service option, basically.
But then that's going to be there's another risk there, isn't there? That then you've got maintained schools risking not being covered, because given the prior conversation that we had regarding schools not engaging with things like deficit recovery, is how do you then make sure that every single maintained school has got their own insurance?
Yeah.
Marie.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm not an expert on this and I don't have any shares in the insurance company, but it does look like the final point of paragraph 2.6 covers it, because it said if they did need to alter their price, this would constitute a break in the long-term agreement, and therefore schools would be able to leave the scheme at this point without penalty. So that implies to me there is a break clause.
Raj, are you just able to move up? Apologies, because I hadn't seen this one in advance.
The last sentence before
Long-term
subheading
agreement.
3.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Yeah, so that does indicate a break clause, doesn't it?
I think so. I'm no expert on insurance or legals, but it looks like it.
Yeah, I think it does say that. It's their intention that the 2-year extension be honoured in terms of the long-term agreement, i.e. that the price is maintained in year 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they've confirmed that if they did need to alter the price, then that would constitute a break in the long-term agreement, and therefore schools would be able to leave the scheme.
Well spotted.
Yeah. Great work, Marie. That's, yeah, perfect. Perfect. Thanks. Anything further before we move to a vote? So I think we probably are secure on that. So it's for, are you able just to close the document, Raj? Is that okay? Because I can't quite see everybody on the call. So, and Raj, I might need your assistance in terms of who is eligible to vote. Obviously, it's Marie and Catherine.
Marie and Catherine, yeah. There were no other maintained members on the call.
Right, so the 2 of you here. So if you'd like to vote for the continued delegation as the purchase of insurance services, could you raise your hand, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Marie, for clarifying.
Yeah, that's great.
No problems.
I think we can call that unanimous. So obviously we won't have any not abstentions, because any votes for options 2 or 3. Great. So it's option 1 unanimously. Thank you very much. And if we move on to item 8, it's the schools forum plan. And I know Raj has done a lot of work on this, because there were some meetings that we had that were very tight in terms of documents either being produced or how we kind of ensured that we had adequate time and efficiency to make sure that there was foresight of not only the reports but also kind of the following on consequences and attendance at meetings. So Raj, over to you really with the kind of forum plan to make sure that we keep forum to both good time and also efficiency.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, myself and officers have been working on this for the past few weeks, and I'll just share my screen with you. Great. So yeah, obviously we've got the dates of meetings and a clearer kind of route to publication prior to meetings, so that we have all reports in order in time. So based upon the previous meetings of forum, we've come up with some standing items that will come to every meeting. So this includes what we've had today: the DSG update, schools monitoring, high needs update, and actually also the usually we bring also an early years update and something regarding the People Growth Fund. Following this, we have any ad hoc items for those meetings based upon what point of the year we need to make decisions. So this is for the next, so sorry, this was today's meeting, obviously. This is the next meeting. And yeah, these are the items that we will be bringing for that meeting. Obviously, that's subject to change. If members do want to consider any other topics, this would be obviously the avenue to raise that, and then myself and officers can explore what we can add to the plan moving forward. So I guess at this stage, we can open that up if there is anything that members feel that they would like to explore that isn't already on the plan, if you've all had a chance to look at it, and we can make a note of that.
Thanks, Raj. Are there anything that people think from looking at that now? And I'm also assuming that if people think of things in between the meetings, Raj, that they can email you or myself or, Charlotte.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether there would be some benefit in us holding the chair's briefing 2 weeks prior to to the meeting, because from having the chair's briefing and then you've got 4 days to do your final paper, sometimes that's an entire change of paper or tact or different things that need to be included, and I found that quite a difficult time frame to then meet. So I'm wondering whether we could put the chair's briefing back a little bit, so then we've got a week to make any changes to papers before they need to go in.
Yeah, of course. Currently, we have it scheduled as 1 week before, but we can obviously move that to 2 weeks if you feel that that gives you additional time to work on the papers.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'd risk of speaking for Paul here is I'm happy to do what works for officers. I think the key thing is to make sure that at the time when we hold the chair's briefing, that there is still enough time for a proposal about what is to be presented, because I wouldn't want that chair's meeting to be sort of a start with a blank sheet of paper and then go away and formulate it. But I do take the point that, you know, if there's a change of emphasis or additional information, then you need to have enough time to complete that. So I'd be guided by yourself and officers about what you feel is appropriate, so that by the time we meet, there can be some rough content, some indicative content, then that can be discussed, and then you produce the final version ready for 7 days prior to the actual forum meeting. Are you happy with that, Paul?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
Great, perfect. And if there's anything there that members do think, and obviously I guess this is not a one-off offer, that you think actually should be added into the forward plan, then obviously that's something that you can propose to Raj and we can add. Great, thank you. And finally, item 9, any other urgent business? Neil.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry for not advising you this beforehand, but I just wanted to give members an update on trade union facilities time, which some schools may have a concern about. So, as you'll be aware, you vote to de-delegate trade union facilities time, the mainstream schools do, and that is a system that's operated by which we then fund schools to release union reps. Most of our union reps, and I think actually all of our union reps now are actually in academies, and so that's where the money flows to. For this year, there's been a delay because we've overspent, and we stopped spending, so that we didn't overspend anymore. But in consultation with finance and others, we've decided that we will fund as schools were expecting for this year, and so that money will be coming to schools in the next, as Yoki says, 2 weeks, I suppose, as the financial year comes to an end. But next year we will be doing things differently, and we're meeting with the unions. I think might be next week, very soon anyway, and we'll have a conversation with them and then come back to you to update how that will operate next year, because obviously we can't continue to be in a position where we're spending more than we get in. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing because we had quite a detailed paper on it previously, but I just wanted forum members to be aware that I've been contacted by a number of schools saying, is the rest of the funding for this year going to be paid? And I want to assure you that yes, for this year it will be, and next year we're going to take a different approach. And that was all. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, and I suppose the approach is making sure that the hours allocated to those roles match the funding that's coming in.
Yes, your members may well remember that we historically there was an SLA that academies could buy into, but in my view that was bureaucratic and not actually very fair in the way that it worked for one reason or another. And so we stopped doing that, but continued with the de-delegation because that supports maintained schools. So yes, yeah, we therefore need to renegotiate what that looks like, making sure that it does reflect the recognition agreement that we as employers of maintained special school staff have with the unions. So, but that's a conversation with the unions, as I say, and we'll give feedback on that. For today, it was more about that this year's will be paid as per schools' expectations.
Great, perfect. Thanks so much, Neil. Any other business? Great, thank you very much, everybody. I declare the meeting closed and have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.